I'm Rebecca Hayes, 35 years old, and my mother slapped me in front of 200 wedding guests under a canopy of white roses and string lights. The sound was sharp enough to silence a string quartet mid-song. I didn't cry or raise my voice. I simply turned back toward her, realizing she had just crossed a line she could never erase. Every eye in that perfect garden was suddenly on us, and in that hush, I spotted a familiar face, a federal prosecutor who owed me a favor. In that instant, I knew this wasn't humiliation. It was the moment everything changed. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever learned the hard way that silence can be stronger than shouting. I grew up in Sacramento in a home where image mattered more than truth. My mother, Linda, carried herself like a queen at every church banquet and neighborhood fundraiser, and she raised us to perform just as gracefully. My father worked long hours as an insurance broker, rarely home long enough to notice how much of his wife's ambition rested on how perfectly her daughters behaved. Hannah, my younger sister, fit the picture easily. Bright smile, soft voice, quick to ask for help in a way that made people feel needed. I was the opposite. From the time I could walk, I wanted independence. I read contracts instead of gossip magazines and learned to keep my own counsel. By my late 20s, I'd carved out a career as a real estate attorney in San Francisco. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. Every deal, every closing was proof that I could build something on my own terms. I'd saved every bonus, skipped vacations, and 10 years later signed the papers on a penthouse overlooking the bay. My mother congratulated me through gritted teeth, then told anyone who'd listened that I'd gotten lucky. Hannah, meanwhile, was bouncing between internships and relationships, always with a cushion, waiting for her at home. Somehow I was expected to be proud of her for simply showing up. Over the years, I became the family's quiet problem solver. When Hannah wanted to go back to school, I co-signed her loan. When her car broke down, I paid half the repair bill. There was always a reason, always some new emergency that needed my help. I told myself it was easier to keep the peace than argue, but peace built on guilt never lasts. Every time I gave in, they took a little more, and the line between generosity and obligation blurred until I could barely see it. When Hannah announced she was getting married, my mother treated it like a royal coronation. The invitations shimmered with gold lettering. The venue was a private garden outside Napa with imported roses and a live cello trio. I was told I didn't need to bring anyone, as though my single status might clash with the theme. Still, I went, because despite everything, some part of me hoped that showing up would mean something. I chose a navy dress understated but elegant, and arrived alone. The moment I stepped onto the flagstone path, I felt the weight of every glance. Distant cousins tilted their heads, trying to remember who I was, and a few guests whispered like they were trading stock tips. My mother spotted me before I reached the seating area. Her smile was polished, her tone cool. "Rebecca, you made it," she said, as if I'd just dropped by uninvited. I reminded her that I'd RSVP'd months ago. She laughed lightly and touched my arm, a gesture that looked affectionate, but felt like control. I could already tell this wasn't going to be a celebration. It was an audition for approval I never asked for. The ceremony itself was flawless golden light through the trees, soft music champagne that sparkled against crystal flutes. Everyone looked picture perfect except for me, standing on the edge of it all, wondering why the happiness around me felt rehearsed. As the sun began to set, servers glided between tables carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres, and laughter drifted across the garden like a scene from a magazine spread. That's when my mother approached again, eyes bright with purpose. "Do you have a moment for a quick family chat?" she asked. Her tone was sweet, but the air shifted. I told her I wanted a drink first, anything to buy a few seconds of calm. At the refreshment table, I poured a glass of champagne and tried to breathe, watching the crowd move like a single organism of polite smiles. Across the lawn, Hannah was already heading my way, her new husband trailing behind with the uncertain look of a man learning his place. She looped her arm through mine, her perfume too sweet, her grin practiced. "There she is, the woman of the hour," she teased. "Isn't that you today?" I asked. "Oh, come on," she laughed. "Everyone's been talking about your penthouse." The words hung there glittering but dangerous. I followed her gaze and saw our mother watching us from a few steps away, her expression tight and expectant. The wedding lights flickered softly in the evening air, and in that glow I sensed the setup, the plan already in motion. My family wasn't celebrating love tonight. They were staging an ambush. I sipped my champagne, forcing a steady breath as the cello swelled somewhere behind us. The night smelled of roses and rain, the kind of beauty that hides its own tension. Hannah's smile didn't waver, but her voice dropped to a whisper. "There's something we wanted to talk to you about," she said. "It's about your place in the city." Her tone was light, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. I looked toward the long tables gleaming with silverware, toward the guests, laughing over their desserts, and I realized I was standing on the edge of something much bigger than a wedding toast. By the time we sat down near the white rose archway, I knew whatever came next would change the course of our family forever. The garden lights shimmered over the tables, reflecting off the gold-rimmed glassware like tiny suns. I sat across from my mother and sister, feeling the weight of their smiles. The air was still heavy from the ceremony, but the warmth had faded, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. The hum of conversation around us seemed far away. It was just the three of us, framed by white roses and polite music, about to have a conversation that had nothing to do with love or celebration. "Rebecca." My mother began folding her hands on the table as though she were presiding over a meeting. "You know your sister and Adam are planning to start a family soon." Her tone carried the same authority she used when instructing caterers or dry cleaners, smooth but absolute. I nodded, unsure why I needed to be part of the discussion. "They can't keep living in that cramped apartment," she continued. "It isn't fitting for them now that they're married." Hannah's face glowed under the soft lights, a practiced picture of innocence. "We were thinking," my mother said, pausing for effect, "that your penthouse could be the perfect home for them." A real fresh start. For a second I thought she was joking, but her expression never changed. "You want me to give them my home?" I asked slowly. "Not give—" Hannah interjected quickly, her voice light. "Think of it as passing it down, keeping it in the family." My mother smiled approvingly, as if Hannah had said something noble. I set my champagne glass down carefully, the stem trembling just enough to betray the tremor in my hand. "Mom, I worked for that penthouse, every inch of it. It's not some vacation property, it's my home." Hannah leaned forward, her tone still sugar-sweet. "Becca, you live alone. It's such a big space for just one person. You're always working anyway. We could really build a life there." I met her eyes and saw it, the expectation, the entitlement wrapped in charm. This wasn't a request. It was a test to see if I would still play the role of the accommodating sister. "You already have so much," my mother added softly. "You've been blessed, Rebecca. It would mean the world to your sister." Their words flowed together like a rehearsed speech, each one sliding into the next. The guests around us clinked glasses, laughed, took photos under twinkling lights. Somewhere behind us, the cello began another graceful melody, but the music only made the moment feel more absurd. I remembered every year of struggle that got me to where I was, the late nights, the endless contracts, the sacrifices. Yet here I was, expected to surrender everything to keep the peace. "I'm not signing over my home," I said finally. My voice was steady, almost quiet. Hannah blinked as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "Come on," she said softly. "It's not like you'd be out on the street. You could get another place, something cozier." My mother's lips tightened. "Don't be difficult, Rebecca. We're asking you to do something meaningful for your family." I looked from one to the other, feeling the years of obligation close in around me. "Meaningful for the family," I repeated. "You mean convenient for you." Hannah's tone shifted, the sweetness cracking just enough to reveal impatience. "Why do you always have to make everything so hard? You've had your success. You're fine. This is about sharing." I leaned back in my chair, watching her. "Sharing doesn't usually come with a legal transfer of property," I said evenly. The silence that followed was short but sharp, like the space between lightning and thunder. My mother's expression hardened into something brittle. "After everything we've done for you," she began, "this is how you repay us." I thought of everything I'd quietly contributed over the years, the tuition payments, the loans, the endless emotional labor. But I didn't say any of it. Instead, I looked at the woman who raised me, dressed in champagne-colored silk and diamond earrings, and said, "No, Mom, this is how I finally stop. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of roses in the breeze. Hannah glanced toward the tables nearby, her cheeks flushing. "You're making a scene," she hissed. "No," I said calmly. "You brought the scene to me." I stood smoothing the folds of my dress. The music carried on, pretending nothing was happening, while the conversation at nearby tables faltered. My mother rose too, voice tight. "Sit down, Rebecca. We're not finished." "We are," I replied, turning toward the reception tent. But before I could take a step, her hand came fast across my cheek. The sound split through the air like a crack in glass. My head turned with the force, though not far. My cheek burned, and for a heartbeat, everything was still. Then came the collective gasp, the rustle of guests turning silverware freezing midair, even the cello trailing off into silence. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward us, stunned into stillness beneath the glowing lights. Hannah stood frozen, one hand over her mouth. My mother's chest rose and fell, the fury still flickering behind her eyes. I straightened slowly, the echo of that strike ringing in my ears. The pain wasn't what stayed with me, it was the clarity. She had shown everyone exactly who she was. I looked at her, meeting her glare with a calm that surprised even me. "That was a mistake," I said quietly. Her expression twisted. "You deserve worse," she spat loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "You've always thought you were better than the rest of us." The whispers started low and scattered, moving through the crowd like a breeze through leaves. A few guests raised their phones, others looked away, embarrassed. The fairy lights reflected in my mother's tear-bright eyes, but I saw no regret there, only the panic of someone who had lost control. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but my voice didn't tremble. "You just told everyone what love means to you," I said softly. Somewhere beyond the chairs, I caught sight of a familiar face, Nora Green. She stood near the back still and watchful, her dark dress blending with the dusk. 3 years earlier, I'd fought for her in court when her late aunt's estate had nearly been taken from her by deceitful relatives. I hadn't charged her a cent, and she'd never forgotten. Now she stood among the witnesses, eyes locked on mine, and I realized the universe had given me a witness no family reputation could silence. My mother's voice shook. "You've shamed us," she said, trembling with fury. "No," I answered quietly. "You did that the moment you turned love into leverage." I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and opened the group chat I used for work, colleagues, journalists, clients, people who respected me beyond the family name. My fingers moved without hesitation. The truth would not be buried under polite smiles again. The garden buzzed with the soft panic of people who didn't know where to look. My mother tried to grab my wrist, but I stepped back. Hannah's new husband stood frozen at a nearby table, wide-eyed, realizing his wedding had become something else entirely. The air felt thick, almost electric, as if the night itself was waiting for someone to take the next step. I hit send. A simple message, factual, measured, describing what had just happened. Then I put the phone down and met my mother's eyes again. "You can't control this one," I said quietly. "Not anymore." She stared at me, breath shallow, her hands trembling. And though I didn't smile, something inside me settled like a door closing at last. Across the lawn, Nora pulled her phone from her purse. She glanced at the screen, then looked up and gave a small nod. It was enough. The shift had begun. I turned away from the table, the echo of the slap still hanging in the air like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing, and I knew that nothing in our family would ever be hidden again. The guests' murmurs grew louder, uneasy, like waves before a storm. I walked toward the fountain at the center of the garden, where the soft trickle of water blended with the hush of voices. Behind me, I could hear my mother calling my name, the sharpness in her tone softening into something almost pleading. But I didn't turn around, not this time. And as I reached the edge of the crowd, the first camera flash went off. That single burst of light sealed the moment, turning private cruelty into public record. Somewhere deep down, I knew the night was far from over. What came next would not be quiet, but it would finally mercifully be honest. The silence that followed the slap seemed endless. Every whisper, every movement felt amplified, the clink of silverware, the faint rustle of silk, the wind moving through the garden. Faces blurred together into one long line of stunned expressions. Some guests avoided my eyes, pretending to check their phones, while others stared openly, caught between disbelief and curiosity. My mother stood a few feet away, her hand still trembling from the blow, her breath shallow but defiant. Hannah looked as if she'd seen a stranger in my place. I didn't move. I kept my chin level, my voice steady. The sound had already carried far enough. There was nothing left to say. The tension spread like a crack in glass. A few waiters froze mid-step, unsure whether to keep serving champagne. Someone dropped a fork, the sound echoing across the patio. The music had stopped, but the faint hum of the fountain behind us filled the space between breaths. My mother's eyes darted from one guest to another, her perfect posture beginning to falter under the weight of so many watching. "You've embarrassed this family," she said sharply, her words trembling. "Do you have any idea what people will think?" I glanced toward the nearest table where two guests had already lifted their phones, recording discreetly behind napkins. "They'll think the truth," I said quietly. Her expression tightened, the first flicker of fear crossing her face. I could feel the warmth still radiating from my cheek, but my focus had shifted. This wasn't just about anger anymore. It was exposure hers, not mine. I reached into my clutch and opened my phone again. A few swipes brought me to my professional contact list, a small circle of attorneys, journalists, and colleagues who'd stood by me when integrity mattered more than image. The message was brief, factual, no theatrics. I hit send, knowing that once those words left my screen, they couldn't be taken back. A murmur rippled through the guests as the tension grew heavier, stretching the night thinner than glass. My mother took a half-step forward, lowering her voice. "Rebecca, put that away. You're making things worse." I looked at her, calm but unflinching. "Worse for who?" The question seemed to land harder than the slap. She hesitated, searching for control she no longer had. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You always take things too far." Hannah stood beside her, her hand gripping Adam's arm, her face pale. "Becca," she started softly, "please don't do this here." I turned toward her. "You already did, Hannah," I said evenly. "I'm just not cleaning it up for you this time." Beyond the tables, Nora Green began to move closer. She hadn't said a word yet, but her expression was unreadable, steady, observant. She stopped a few feet behind my mother, her black dress stark against the soft gold lights. My mother noticed her then, and I could see the moment recognition hit. A faint flicker of unease crossed her face. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear. "No," I said quietly. "It's just beginning." The first camera flash came from near the dessert table, then another. By the time I turned, two more guests were holding up their phones. Hannah's voice broke through the growing noise. "Stop filming," she cried, but it was too late. The crowd had already chosen its focus. A few people whispered words like assault and unbelievable, while others just stared, unwilling to be the first to leave. The air felt thick, the kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to see what they'd rather ignore. I took one step back, keeping my eyes on my mother. She looked suddenly smaller, no longer the untouchable hostess who ran every event with precision. Her voice came softer now, desperate under the veneer. "Rebecca, you'll ruin yourself," she said. "You think people respect you? They'll only see this." I met her gaze. "They'll see exactly what you've shown them." For the first time all evening she had no response. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Nora had her phone in her hand, her thumb moving over the screen. A moment later mine buzzed in my clutch. One new message, I saw everything. I looked up again, and she gave me the faintest nod. The message was simple, but it grounded me. I wasn't alone in this anymore. Someone credible, someone untouchable had witnessed what really happened. The murmur of voices grew louder as the tension in the garden began to shift. A few guests gathered near the archway, pretending to check the time. Others whispered to each other, weighing whether to stay or quietly slip away. I could see Adam trying to calm Hannah, whispering something that made her turn sharply away from him. My mother stood frozen, torn between outrage and panic, her mask slipping one crack at a time. The night air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of roses and wet grass. Somewhere beyond the trees, thunder rolled softly, distant but inevitable. I took a slow breath, then turned back to my chair. The phone in my hand buzzed again, this time from my group chat. Replies were already coming in, colleagues confirming receipt, journalists asking for verification, others simply saying, "We've got you covered." I didn't respond. I just tucked the phone away and looked around the garden one last time. The lights above flickered slightly in the evening breeze. Guests had begun to drift toward the parking area, murmuring polite excuses about early mornings or long drives. The quartet, unsure whether to resume, stood quietly by the fountain, instruments still in hand. The wedding that had begun with music and laughter was unraveling in slow motion, and no one knew how to stop it. My mother turned to Hannah, whispering sharply, but I couldn't hear the words. Hannah looked at me once, just once, with a mix of anger and shame that told me everything I needed to know. I walked toward the path leading out of the garden, my heels clicking softly against the stones. Every step felt deliberate, steady. The sound of my mother's voice trailed behind me, trying to salvage what couldn't be saved. "It was just a misunderstanding," she called. "You're overreacting." Her tone rose slightly more to convince the crowd than me. I didn't turn back. Halfway to the gate, I stopped. The hush had fallen again, and when I turned, I saw Nora standing near the front row of chairs, her badge case open in her hand. She hadn't said anything yet, but the gesture was enough to still the whispers. My mother's mouth fell open slightly as Nora stepped forward, calm and unhurried. "Mrs. Hayes," she said evenly, "I saw what happened." The words carried through the quiet garden, each one clear as glass. My mother blinked rapidly, unsure how to respond. "You're mistaken," she managed. Nora shook her head. "No, I'm not. And I don't take what I saw lightly." The guests began whispering again, but this time the tone had changed. People who had tried to look away were now leaning forward, eager to catch every word. My mother looked around helplessly, realizing that her authority, the one she'd built over years of social charm and control, was slipping away in real time. I met Nora's eyes again, and she gave me a small, deliberate nod, the kind that told me I could stand still now. She would handle what came next. I felt the tension in my shoulders finally ease. My cheeks still throbbed faintly, but beneath the sting was a quiet sense of resolve. The performance was over. My mother's empire of appearances built on guilt and silence had just cracked in front of 200 witnesses. I turned back toward the exit once more, hearing the low hum of voices behind me rising into a mix of shock and disbelief. The last thing I saw before stepping out under the archway was Nora, steady, composed, standing between my family and the truth they'd tried so hard to hide. The crowd's attention had shifted fully to her now. Whatever she said next would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone who had watched this unfold. And as the first drop of rain touched the back of my hand, I knew the night was far from finished. The storm hadn't passed, it was just beginning to break. The rain started just as Nora stepped forward, a soft drizzle that turned the air silver under the garden lights. Guests shifted uneasily in their chairs, the scent of damp roses mixing with tension. My mother's face was pale now, her posture rigid, trying to hold on to authority that was slipping through her fingers. Nora's voice, calm but steady, carried across the crowd. "Mrs. Hayes, I saw what happened here tonight." She paused long enough for the silence to deepen. "And I won't pretend I didn't." My mother blinked, confusion flickering for a moment before indignation returned. "You have no idea what this is about," she snapped. "It's a family matter." Nora nodded slightly, her tone even. "You're right. It is. But when a parent strikes their adult child in public, it becomes something more than that." Her words cut through the murmur of whispers. The statement wasn't loud, but it was final, as if she'd drawn a line through the night itself. Hannah stepped forward quickly, her gown brushing against the wet grass. "Please, this isn't necessary," she said. "It was a misunderstanding. We just got caught up in emotions." Nora turned her gaze toward her, polite but unwavering. "I watched it happen. Nothing about that was a misunderstanding." Adam stood a few feet behind, silent and rigid, the color drained from his face. The guests looked back and forth between them, waiting for someone to take control, but no one moved. I stayed near the fountain, the rain cooling my skin. The sting on my cheek had faded into a dull throb, replaced by the strange calm that comes after a long-held truth finally surfaces. My mother opened her mouth again, But Nora continued her tone, shifting slightly firm but compassionate. "You don't have to speak, Rebecca. You've said enough. I can confirm what I witnessed." The crowd, still hovering between curiosity and discomfort, leaned closer to hear. My mother's voice came sharp and brittle. "And who exactly are you?" Nora reached into her purse and pulled out a small black case, opening it with a deliberate motion. "Nora Green, Federal Prosecutor, Southern District of California." The words hung in the air. No one spoke. Even the rain seemed to pause for a heartbeat. The title alone changed everything. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was an official witness to an act that couldn't be hidden under charm or excuses. My mother tried to recover, straightening her shoulders. "You're overreacting," she said. "This was a private moment, taken out of context." Nora's expression didn't waver. "No, Mrs. Hayes. What happened was public witnessed and recorded." Her gaze drifted briefly toward the guests still holding their phones. "You should be aware that several videos are already circulating." A flicker of panic crossed my mother's face, and she turned to Hannah as though searching for help. But Hannah looked lost, her hands clasped tightly together, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Nora took a small step forward, her voice low enough to be steady, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't about punishment, it's about accountability. What happened here is something I've seen countless times: families using power and image to silence the one who finally refuses to submit." Her words weren't rehearsed. They came like truth that had waited too long to be spoken. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, not in judgment now, but in recognition. Nora turned slightly, addressing the guests. "You've all witnessed it. The discomfort, the whispering, the attempt to minimize what just happened. It's easy to excuse because it's family, but family doesn't excuse humiliation." My mother's composure cracked then. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I was trying to hold this family together." Nora nodded once slowly. "By force?" she asked quietly. The question landed heavy, and the answer hung unsaid. The drizzle had turned to light rain droplets collecting on the edges of the floral archway, the petals drooping under the weight. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Nora had taken the space that once belonged to my mother, the space of authority, of command, and filled it with calm truth. Around us, guests began to whisper again, but their tone had changed. Some nodded faintly, others turned away, clearly uncomfortable but no longer indifferent. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. 2 women from my professional circle seated near the aisle, pulling out their phones, typing quickly. Clara Morrison was one of them. We hadn't spoken in months, but her glance toward me was steady, a quiet confirmation. She'd seen everything, too. Hannah's voice finally broke through the rain. "Becca, please make her stop." She sounded small, pleading. I turned to her slowly. "I didn't start this, Hannah." She shook her head, her mascara smudging in the drizzle. "I didn't know Mom would hit you." Her words came out barely above a whisper, but they carried. A few people gasped quietly. My mother looked at her in disbelief. "Hannah," she snapped, but it was too late. The admission hung there, undeniable. Nora glanced toward me once more, then back to the crowd. "What we saw tonight isn't about wealth or property. It's about control: who holds it, who gives it, and who finally lets it go." The faint clapping of rain on the tent above us filled the silence that followed. Even those who hadn't understood before were beginning to see the shift unfolding in front of them. My mother's voice cracked under its own strain. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," she said, directing it at me now, not Nora. "You think people will still respect you after this?" I met her eyes. Maybe, maybe not. But they'll know the truth. It wasn't a challenge, just a statement. She opened her mouth again, then stopped. For once, she had no script to follow. The guests began to move quietly at first, then in a slow ripple. Chairs scraped against stone footsteps shuffled toward the exits. A few people murmured apologies as they left, unsure who they were apologizing to. The soft music that had defined the night was gone, now replaced by the sound of rain and the faint buzz of phones capturing what was left of the evening. Nora closed her badge case and tucked it back into her purse. "I'll be filing a statement," she said simply, her eyes on my mother. "Not to humiliate you, but to document what happened." My mother said nothing. She only turned away, her shoulders trembling under the weight of a silk shawl. Hannah clutched Adam's arm, her face streaked with tears, but he stood still silent, a man realizing he'd married into a family already unraveling. Nora looked at me once more. "You don't have to stay here," she said softly. I nodded. The crowd had thinned the table's half-abandoned rain, dripping from the petals onto forgotten champagne glasses. As I started toward the path, my phone vibrated again, a flood of messages lighting up the screen. Some from friends, others from reporters, some simply saying, "We saw. We stand with you." I walked slowly through the garden gate, the gravel crunching beneath my heels. Behind me, the lights flickered once, then steadied. The sound of my mother's voice had faded into the rain, replaced by the low hum of voices and the sharp tap of Nora's heels crossing the patio. At the top of the hill, I turned back once. The garden looked smaller now, like a stage after the curtain falls. Guests were leaving in clusters, umbrellas glowing faintly under the lights. My mother stood alone near the archway, her back to me, the perfect image finally cracked beyond repair. I didn't feel anger anymore, only distance wide and quiet. The air smelled of wet roses and thunder. I reached for the car keys in my clutch and breathed in deeply before stepping into the rain. The night wasn't finished. The fallout hadn't even begun. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what would come next. The next morning came gray and quiet, the kind of light that feels heavier than it should. I woke to the buzz of my phone, its screen filled with notifications, emails, messages, headlines. The story had already spread. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, a guest's recording from the wedding had gone viral. The caption read, "Mother of the bride slaps daughter over penthouse dispute." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the words swimming slightly as I scrolled through. The video was short, barely 20 seconds, but the sound of the slap was unmistakable. The image froze on my face, calm still, eyes locked on hers. That silence had done more than any speech could have. By mid-morning, reporters were reaching out. Some were cautious, others relentless. My assistant Claire had left 3 voicemails asking how to respond. I dialed her back while standing by the window, the skyline stretching out pale and washed beneath the clouds. "We're getting flooded," she said. Requests from the Chronicle, Legal Affairs Weekly, even a few television stations. Her voice softened. "Everyone wants a statement." I took a breath. "Prepare something brief," I said. "Grateful for support, no public comment for now. Focus remains on our clients." She hesitated. "Are you sure I'm sure?" The call ended and the quiet filled the room again. I made coffee, its scent grounding against the chaos of my phone lighting up every few seconds. My penthouse had never felt so still. The hardwood floors reflected the gray light and the city below hummed faintly like a distant tide. It should have felt lonely, but it didn't. For once, the silence was mine alone, not something imposed by guilt or fear of being labeled difficult. By noon, Nora called. Her voice was calm, steady, the same tone she'd used in courtrooms and depositions. "I wanted to check in," she said. "The video is circulating fast, but you don't need to worry about defamation or legal risk. You did nothing wrong." I nodded even though she couldn't see it. "I know," I said quietly. "But thank you." There was a pause. "Rebecca," she added, "people are paying attention. Sometimes one moment changes the conversation more than 1,000 quiet compromises." Her words settled deep. "I'll handle anything that needs handling," she continued. "If your mother or sister try to twist the story, I'll make sure the truth stays intact." When the call ended, I set the phone down and opened my laptop. My inbox was a blur of subject lines: media inquiry, statement request, follow-up on garden event. I scrolled past them all until I reached one name, Clara Morrison. Her message was brief. "I was there last night. You handled yourself with grace. If you ever want to tell your side, it'll be done respectfully." She'd attached her number. I didn't reply, but I kept the email open on the screen, letting the words rest there as proof that not everyone saw me through the distorted lens my family had crafted. By late afternoon, the sun finally broke through the clouds, streaking light across the bay. I went for a walk to clear my head. The wind off the water carried the faint smell of salt and asphalt, a blend only this city could make. People passed by their lives untouched by what had unfolded just hours before, and it felt oddly grounding. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't shrinking to fit anyone's expectations. I wasn't explaining my choices or defending my space. When I got back home, I found 3 missed calls from an unknown number and 1 text from Hannah. "Can we talk?" "Please, I didn't know she would hit you." I read it twice, then locked the screen. The weight of those words lingered, but I couldn't decide whether they were remorse or damage control. Either way, I wasn't ready to answer. I walked into the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter. Through the window, the city glowed orange with sunset, and I could almost feel the shift, something breaking open, something new forming in its place. Later that evening, Claire sent over a summary of the online coverage. She'd highlighted the key points, multiple outlets confirming Nora's statement, several witnesses backing her account, and a wave of public response supporting what they called a professional woman standing her ground. There were critics too, of course, anonymous comments accusing me of overreacting or seeking attention, but they were drowned out by messages of solidarity. Women from across the country sharing stories of family pressure control and the price of keeping peace. The collective voice was overwhelming, but it carried something I hadn't felt before: validation, without apology. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights dimmed and the city's reflection stretching across the glass. My phone buzzed once more. A message from Nora. "You did the right thing. Don't let them rewrite it." I typed a simple thank you back. Her calm certainty was something I'd needed more than I'd realized. Outside, the rain had returned gentle this time, tapping against the windows like a metronome. I let it play while the rest of the world kept turning stories spinning out beyond my control, but all orbiting one unshakable truth: I had stopped pretending. Around midnight, my phone lit up again. This time, it was an unfamiliar number, but the message made me pause. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Amanda from Channel 9. We have footage from multiple guests confirming what happened. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to share your experience in your own words before others frame it for you." I read it twice, then set the phone face down. The world was already watching. I didn't need to add more noise. Instead, I opened the window and let the cool air in. Somewhere below, a siren wailed faintly and faded. I thought about my mother, about how quickly the world she built on perfection and control had collapsed in one public moment. And I thought about Hannah, her text still unanswered, caught between loyalty and shame. The old urge to fix things rose for an instant, but it passed just as quickly. I wasn't that version of myself anymore. When I finally went to bed, the sky over the bay had turned clear again. My phone rested silent on the nightstand. Tomorrow would bring more headlines, more questions, maybe even another round of calls. But none of it frightened me. The story was out of my hands now, and somehow that was its own kind of peace. As I closed my eyes, I could still hear Nora's voice echoing softly from earlier that day, steady, sure, and unyielding. Sometimes one moment changes everything. And as I drifted into sleep, I knew that moment had already done exactly that. 2 days after the wedding, the story was still everywhere. News anchors spoke my name in calm, measured tones, their voices barely masking fascination. Screens flashed with split images of the garden, the headlines scrolling beneath public confrontation at luxury wedding sparks debate on family power and boundaries. Every outlet had a different angle, but the same clip the moment my mother's hand connected, followed by silence. I didn't watch it anymore. Once was enough. Claire had taken over the press management, fielding calls, filtering requests. "You've become a talking point," she said during our morning call. "Half the commentators are praising you for composure, the rest are arguing about family respect." She paused. "Either way, they're still talking." I thanked her quietly and asked her to decline every interview. Fame had never been the goal. Peace was. By the third morning, a new headline surfaced: "Federal prosecutor confirms witness account family altercation at Hayes' wedding." Nora's statement had gone public not as a press conference, but as a formal acknowledgement issued through her office. It was brief, professional, and devastatingly clear. An act of physical aggression occurred in my presence at a private event. I witnessed it and have provided a statement verifying the incident. That one paragraph carried more weight than anything I could have said. Messages poured in after that. Former colleagues I hadn't heard from in years wrote to say they admired how I'd handled it. Clients reached out not to gossip, but to confirm meetings business as usual. Somehow, that normalcy mattered most. It meant my work, my identity outside of them, was still intact. That evening, I found myself at my office long after sunset. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city lights painting everything in gold and blue. Papers were spread across my desk, contracts, closing statements, things that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Yet beneath it all, there was a sense of stillness I hadn't felt before. For years I'd carried the unspoken weight of keeping the peace. Now there was no peace to keep, only the truth that had finally spoken for itself. My phone vibrated against the desk. Hannah again. This time she left a voicemail. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. Becca, I don't know where to start. Everything's falling apart. Mom hasn't left the house. Adam's furious. People keep asking questions. I didn't mean for any of this. She hesitated. I know you won't pick up, but I needed to say I'm sorry. I can't undo what she did, but I shouldn't have let it get that far. Her voice broke slightly near the end. Please just call me back. We can fix this. I let the message finish and didn't move for a long time. The city outside glimmered like another world entirely, one where family names didn't matter, where silence wasn't mistaken for weakness. I pressed delete not out of anger, but because I had nothing left to fix. The next morning brought a different kind of attention. A producer from West Coast Legal Review emailed asking to feature my firm in an upcoming issue on women reshaping real estate law. No mention of the incident, just an invitation to discuss career milestones. I read the message twice before forwarding it to Claire with a short note. Schedule for next month. The irony wasn't lost on me. The scandal meant to shame me had only amplified the work I'd built quietly for years. Later that afternoon, I received another message, this one from Clara Morrison. A few outlets are spinning new narratives, she wrote. If you'd like, I can help correct them. You don't have to go on record, but truth travels better when guided. I called her back. Her voice was warm, grounded. I'm not chasing headlines, I said. I know, she replied. That's why it matters. You stayed calm. That's rare. She paused. People need to see women handle power without losing it. That's the story. We spoke for nearly an hour, not about the slap, but about perspective, the quiet resilience behind every choice. She promised her article would focus on integrity, not drama. You won't recognize the gossip by the time I'm done, she said with a soft laugh. I trusted her. She'd seen it unfold firsthand. That night I went for a walk along the waterfront. The sky was clear, the air cool and sharp. Across the bay, the bridge lights shimmered like threads of fire. Couples passed by, their laughter fading into the hum of traffic. I thought about Nora's words about how one moment could change the course of an entire life. She was right. The world didn't shift. All at once it cracked quietly, then rearranged itself piece by piece until nothing fit the same way. When I returned home, I found a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, just folded paper with my name written in my mother's handwriting. For a while, I stood there staring at it, unsure whether to pick it up. Finally, I did. The note was brief. Rebecca, the world doesn't know the full story. I was trying to protect our family from shame. You've made it worse. You've humiliated me. But despite everything, you're still my daughter. I hope one day you'll understand that what I did was out of love. The handwriting trembled near the end, but the words were sharp, familiar control disguised as concern. I folded the note and placed it in a drawer. There was no anger, no relief, just clarity. Some people mistake ownership for love, and no apology can untangle that. The following morning, Clara's article went live. The headline read, Grace Under Pressure, When Boundaries Become Courage. It wasn't sensational. It was simple, measured, and fair. She described the wedding briefly, then shifted focus to the years of quiet work behind the woman in that viral clip. The piece ended with a single quote from Nora's strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply refuses to bow. By midday, my inbox overflowed again, but this time it wasn't noise. It was gratitude from strangers, professionals, even distant relatives I barely knew. Stories of people who'd found the courage to say no, to stop giving away pieces of themselves for the sake of harmony. The story had grown beyond me, and in that expansion, something softened. The shame my mother tried to weaponize had turned into connection. That evening, I stood by my window again, watching the city lights come alive. Somewhere below, life carried on traffic, rolling laughter rising from the streets. My phone buzzed one last time, a new message from Nora. Dinner next week. My treat. You've earned a quiet one. I smiled, setting the phone aside. For once, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was steady, clean, and mine to keep. The world could keep its headlines. I had no more statements to give, no more battles to fight. The hardest part had already happened the moment I stopped trying to belong where I was never meant to shrink. The night stretched soft over the city lights, glinting like fragments of something once broken, but still beautiful. Tomorrow would bring its own noise, but tonight there was peace, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. The week that followed was a blur of consequences, quiet ones, the kind that move underneath the noise. I never spoke to my mother again after her letter, but the fallout unfolded all on its own. The wedding venue released a statement confirming that the incident had disrupted the event and caused multiple guests to leave early. Vendors started to distance themselves, subtle but unmistakable. The florist canceled future bookings with her. The event planner deleted her photos from social media. Even the local society pages that once adored Linda Hayes went silent. I didn't gloat. There was nothing satisfying about watching a woman so skilled at control finally lose it in front of the world. The truth had simply caught up as it always does. My name, once tied to hers in every introduction, began to stand alone. Invitations that used to come addressed to the Hayes family now came to Rebecca Hayes Esquio only. The separation was quiet but complete. Meanwhile, Nora and I met for dinner at a small restaurant tucked between an art gallery and a bookstore downtown. The place was calm, warm light reflecting off dark wood and wine glasses. She arrived in a soft gray coat, her posture still carrying the calm authority that had silenced 200 people that night. When she sat across from me, she smiled faintly. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Better than expected," I said, honestly. "It's strange, but I think I'm lighter." She nodded, her eyes kind. "That's what happens when you stop carrying other people's expectations." We talked about everything except the wedding, work, travel plans, her new case at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But near the end of the meal, she reached into her bag and slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a printed copy of the official statement her office had issued, signed and sealed. "Keep it," she said. "It's not about the press. It's about record. If anyone tries to rewrite the truth, you'll have proof." I folded the paper neatly and tucked it into my purse. "Thank you," I said quietly. She smiled again. "You did the hard part. I just made sure people noticed." A few days later, Clara's article reached the National Wire. Within hours, news outlets across the country picked it up. The headline read, "When Boundaries Become Breaking Points, the Viral Moment That Changed the Conversation." It wasn't sensational. It was thoughtful. She wrote about family power, financial pressure, and the expectation that successful daughters must always yield to keep the peace. My name appeared only twice, both times with context and respect. By evening, my inbox was filled again, letters from women in law, finance, medicine, even homemakers, each telling their own version of the same story. I read every one of them. The patterns were the same: silent sacrifices, quiet dismissals, the turning point that finally pushed them to stop apologizing for existing. While the world digested that story, my mother tried to fight back. She called a family friend who worked in PR, hoping to correct the narrative. But by then the footage had been verified, and Nora's witness statement made any denial impossible. The public sympathy she expected never came. Even those who once admired her grace began to see it as performance. For a woman who'd spent her life curating reputation, that kind of silence was worse than any headline. Hannah, on the other hand, stayed quiet. I learned through mutual acquaintances that she and Adam had postponed their honeymoon. They'd both taken leaves from work to regroup. The picture-perfect couple from the garden was now a story people whispered about, wondering what would become of them. One afternoon, as I left my office, I saw her text appear on my phone again. "I miss you. I'm sorry for everything. Mom's not well. Please talk to me." I read it, then locked the screen. Guilt tugged for a moment, but I let it pass. She had chosen her side when it mattered most. That Friday, my firm hosted a small networking event for clients and colleagues. I almost didn't go worried about whispers or awkward questions. But when I walked into the room, something unexpected happened. No one looked away. There were no forced smiles, no tension. Instead, people came forward with genuine warmth. One partner from another firm clasped my hand and said, "You handled yourself with grace most of us only hope for." Another guest, a woman in her 60s, said softly, "It was overdue for someone to draw a line like that." Their kindness wasn't loud. It was steady, like quiet applause in a room that finally understood the weight of what had been carried too long. Later that night, as the event wound down, I stepped outside for air. The city lights shimmered off the wet pavement, the hum of passing cars blending into a soft rhythm. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from a conference organizer I'd met years ago. They wanted me to speak at an upcoming panel, Women in Law Leadership Without Apology. I read the subject line twice, then smiled. The irony was almost poetic. The following week, I received word that my firm's board had unanimously approved expanding our mentorship program for young attorneys. Claire told me the idea had gained traction after everything that happened. "You've become a symbol of resilience," she said. "They want to put real structure behind that." I agreed immediately. If something good could grow from all this, it would be helping others claim their voices earlier than I did. Still, life wasn't without its shadows. One evening, while reviewing contracts in my office, I received a call from a hospital in my hometown. The nurse explained that Linda had been admitted for exhaustion and stress. I thanked her for calling but didn't promise a visit. I hung up, sat for a long time in the quiet, and stared at the skyline beyond the glass. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, only the weight of history trying one last time to pull me back. I didn't drive home that night. Instead, I stopped at a late-night diner near the bay, the kind with chipped coffee cups and quiet booths. I sat by the window watching the reflection of neon signs ripple across the water. It struck me that this was what freedom really looked like. Not grand, not dramatic, just steady breathing and space to exist without being managed or measured. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, refilled my cup and smiled. "Rough day?" she asked. "Long week," I answered. She nodded knowingly. "Those end eventually." Her words lingered as I left a tip and stepped back into the night. The city air was cool, the kind that carried promise rather than burden. When I reached my building, I found another note waiting under the door. This one was from Hannah. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. "I'm done trying to fix it. I just want peace, too. Maybe someday we can start over as sisters, not as rivals." I folded the paper carefully and set it on the table beside my keys. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was something, maybe a small crack of light after a long shadow. As I stood there in my quiet apartment, the city stretching beneath me, I realized that justice didn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looked like release, the moment you stopped chasing approval that was never meant to be earned. Outside, the wind shifted cool against the glass, carrying the faint hum of life moving forward. I turned off the lights, letting the city glow take over, and for the first time, the view didn't feel distant. It felt like home. A few weeks passed before the noise finally began to fade. The headlines shifted to other stories, the videos slowed in circulation, and my phone, once vibrating every hour, fell silent again. The quiet that replaced it wasn't empty, it was steady, earned. I spent more mornings watching the sunrise over the bay from my kitchen window, the light spilling gold across the hardwood floors. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval to start my day. One Saturday, I drove north along the coast, no destination in mind. The road curved between cliffs and ocean, the air sharp with salt. It had been a long time since I'd taken a drive just for the sake of breathing. Somewhere near Point Reyes, I stopped at a small cafe overlooking the water. The waitress set down a cup of coffee and smiled. "Long drive?" she asked. "Long few years," I said, and she laughed softly, the kind of understanding that needs no explanation. I sat there for a while, letting the rhythm of the waves untangle everything that had once felt impossible to escape. When I came home that evening, there was an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a short note from Hannah written on plain stationery. "I've started therapy. I know I have a lot to face. I hope you're okay. Maybe one day we can talk." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside her earlier note. It didn't undo what had happened, but it was real. Maybe the first honest thing between us in years. I didn't respond right away. Some wounds need time before words can find their way through. A few days later, Nora and I met for lunch downtown. She looked relaxed, almost content her work blazer traded for a soft sweater. Over sandwiches and tea, she told me she'd been offered a teaching position at a law school nearby. "It feels like a good time to pass things on," she said. I smiled. "You've been doing that your whole life." She grinned, tilting her head. "And now so have you." Before we left, she handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a silver pen with a single line engraved, "Truth speaks quietly, but lasts forever." I ran my thumb over the engraving, feeling the weight of those words. Spring arrived early that year. My firm's mentorship program grew faster than expected. Young women filled the conference room each month, some fresh out of law school, others switching careers later in life. They came with notebooks and nervous smiles, ready to learn how to stand their ground in rooms that too often demanded silence. I watched them and saw pieces of myself at every stage, hungry, uncertain, determined. What began as damage control after a public spectacle had become something far more lasting, a way to turn what hurt into something that helped. My mother never called again. I heard through neighbors that she'd sold her house and moved south to live with a cousin. There was no satisfaction in that knowledge, only a quiet understanding that distance was the only peace left between us. We were no longer at war, but no longer pretending either. Sometimes that's all reconciliation can be, the choice to stop fighting and start living separately. On quiet nights when the city hum softened, I still thought about that garden, the roses, the rain, the single sound that changed everything. It wasn't anger that stayed with me, but the moment after the breath I took when I realized I didn't owe silence anymore. That's what freedom felt like. Not revenge, not triumph, just stillness with no fear attached. People often think justice is about winning, but I learned it's about reclaiming your place in your own story. For me, it wasn't about the slap or the scandal. It was about no longer apologizing for standing upright. My mother built her world on control. I built mine on truth. Both of us lived with the results we chose. Months later, at the firm's annual gala, Clara stopped me by the door. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Her question was gentle, not probing. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. No, because peace isn't what they give you after the storm, it's what you build when you stop hiding from it. She smiled. "That's a good line," she said. "I might borrow it someday." When I left the event that night, the city shimmered in rain, again lights flickering across wet pavement. I walked slowly, breathing in the scent of spring rain and jasmine from the planter boxes along the street. Everything was ordinary again, and that was the best kind of ending I could have hoped for. I unlocked my door, slipped off my shoes, and poured a cup of tea. Through the glass, the skyline glowed soft and familiar. I thought of all the versions of myself. I had been the daughter who stayed quiet, the woman who built alone, the person who finally stood her ground. They had all led me here. I wasn't defined by the chaos anymore. I was defined by what I chose after it. If you've ever been pushed to make yourself smaller to keep someone else comfortable, I hope you remember this. You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to protect your peace, even if it means standing alone for a while. And if this story found its way to you tonight, take a moment before you go. Breathe deep. Think of the life you're building and hold on to your own quiet truth, because sometimes that's the loudest justice of all. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a little courage tonight, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one.